Hello everybody and welcome to the Game 2 analysis of the World Championship match Magnus Carlsen against Karjakin. Today the challenger Karjakin for first time in the match with the white piece, and the question was, would he be able to put some pressure on his opponent after Carlsen was not really able to in the first game of the match. So let's get right into it and see what happened. What was the first move to challenger? E4. And as expected, Carlsen answers with E5. Knight F3, Knight C6, Bishop B5, and here the first surprise. Carlsen for a long time, or it is at least considered his main weapon in this position, is the Berlin defense, or sometimes also called Berlin wall, Knight F6, and this is one of the reasons, this particular defense, that people have shifted from playing one E4 to one D4, one Knight F3 or one C4. Because white players really haven't found a way to crack through this defense. But it seems like either Carlsen didn't want to find out what Karjakin had prepared here just yet, or maybe Carlsen wanted to be the first one to surprise his opponent. A6, of course, cannot be said to be a major surprise either, but, well, probably Karjakin spent most of his preparation on the Berlin wall. So now we just have a regular Roy Lopez. Knight F6, castle, bishop E7, and now D3. This move has become more trendy recently because it limits black's options and already makes it clear white is going to play D3, keep his rook on E1, on F1 for now, not needing to play rook E1 anytime soon because the pawn is protected. And some additional ideas here have been seen on the top level. Now B5, bishop B3, D6. Now that the pawn on E5 is protected, black is threatening to go knight A5 and exchange the bishop on B3. That's why white creates some space for the bishop, and here Karjakin goes A3, which is in fact the third most played move in this position. Usually people go A4 or C3, but A3 has become more popular because once again it's adding some more new ideas to the position, and really in all these Roy Lopez positions people are always trying to find something new and surprise the opponent, or at least get slightly different positions on the board. Actually, Karjakin himself had played A4 in a previous game. So let's stick with A3. Once again, emphasis here, the bishop can retreat to A2 if needed. If black plays knight A5, that's one idea, and also A3 is stopping potentially B4 in the future. Now, castle. Karjakin also has played A3, and his opponent in this position, Aronia, in 2013 played bishop E6, which is another decent move, which would lead to slightly different positions. But Carlsen goes for castle, and now knight C3, and that's actually a little bit unusual in those Roy Lopez positions because in many cases white decides to develop the knight via D2, F1, and then goes to G3 or maybe E3. But here, well, white keeps the rook on F1 for now, and knight C3 is taking some more control over the center. And well, the knight can also maybe come to G3 via E2. So, just a different kind of play. Black has tried many moves in this position. Most played move is bishop G4, which makes sense to pin the knight on F3. But Carlsen plays his second most played move here, knight A5. And in fact, just as a side note, which might be interesting, Carlsen has had this position on the board as well before, and that was really a very dramatic game. He had this position against Sweetler in the Candidates Tournament 2013, last round, in which he eventually qualified for a World Championship match, but he lost that game. So just a funny coincidence. Svidler in this position played bishop b7. But Carlsen goes knight a5. Now white wants to keep the bishop, so bishop retreats. And now bishop e6, offering the trade of bishops, and black's not really afraid of having double pawns here because it gives him some more control over the center and the position is completely sound. So instead, Karjakin goes d4, now asking some questions in the center, allowing black to take on a2 and having a slightly awkward position with the rook. And even up to this point, Carlsen has already had this position in a recent game this year in Paris as part of the Grand Prix chess tour. And there he played against Topalov, he played the move knight c6. But against Karjakin he chose a better move, rook e8. So you can be quite sure that Karjakin had looked at this as well and was probably prepared to answer knight c6. After which it seems like white has a little bit of an edge after d5, knight b8 and queen d3, knight bd7 and b4, taking away the c5 square, claiming some more space, a little bit more comfortable for white. So rook e8, Carlsen looked at his game probably against Topalov afterwards and improves on his play. And this position, according to my database, there has been only one game so far in which white played queen d3, which is a sensible move, but Karjakin goes rook a1. The rook is not well placed on a2, needs to move back at some point anyway, so why not now? Especially because white isn't clear yet on where to put this bishop. So just a nice improving move here. Knight c4, black's also improving his piece. The knight was not greatly placed on a5, and as we already said, if the knight goes back to c6, well then white can push and gain space with tempo by going d5. Now rook e1 makes a lot of sense here to support the pawn on e4. Rook c8, that was, well, not criticized, but people in the commentary talked about this move as a little bit mysterious because it's not clear what black is trying to achieve. Well, it seems like Carlsen just wanted to play a waiting move, and this move is not doing too much. His idea is not to go c5, but in the future, in some cases, the rook may well be better placed on c8 than on a8. Now Karjakin does the same, improves his position little by little. h3, a common move in many positions to give the king some space and not allow any back rank mates in a far future. Black does the same, h6, and says, well, we can both wait. Let's see who first takes any action, and Karjakin does so by pushing the knight away from c4, playing b3, knight b6, and bishop b2. Now finally developing his last minor piece onto this long diagonal. But really the bishop is not as effective here because the knight is kind of blocking it, and white is not really having much here. Of course white has the space advantage, but that's about it, and the black position is very solid. Bishop f8 makes a lot of sense here, opening up the e-file for the rook. Also in some cases black could put the bishop on g7, but right now the bishop is perfectly placed on f8. And now, in fact, Karjakin decides to ease the tension in the center. He takes on e5 and gives away his space advantage, his center control. I personally would have liked queen d3 a little bit better, just keeping the tension as it is in the center right now, playing rook a1 next, and going to see what happens. White really doesn't have much of an advantage here, but it seems to me there would be a better way to just keep some tension in the position. Another move which you might consider here is knight h4, which is a common maneuver to get to f5. But it looks like here black could take on d4, which is always of course an option you need to consider as white, and then go c5 and follow with c4. And now you can already see the rook is better placed on c8 than on a8. exactly for those kind of variations, I think Carlsen put the rook on c8, and now after queen d4, black can follow with d5 and it's completely fine here. So let's look at the game. D takes e5, D takes e5, and now the next move really leads to, well, simplifications, I would say. Here still white could have kept a little bit of pressure, I would say, with the move knight a2. That first looks like a defensive move. Why move the knight back? Well, the point is bring the knight to b4. And also right now, white is attacking the pawn on e5. So, for example, now knight bd7, and now, well, knight b4 would be possible. Another idea is to go knight c1, aiming to go to d3 and putting some more pressure on this pawn e5. c5 to answer knight d3 with c4, then white could respond to c4 himself. It's just a completely different game. There's just so much more in the position, so much more potential than what we'll see in the game. And this knight is kind of white's problem child anyway. The knight really doesn't have a great perspective. I mean, it would like to go to d5, but this square is nicely covered by black, and the knight's not doing anything right now. So knight a2 would have been a nice alternative. So a4 was played by Karjakin, of course threatening to take on b5, win a pawn, but black simply responds c6 and keeps everything under control, controls the d5 square once again. It's all great for black here, no problems whatsoever. Of course, Karjakin was hoping for b4 and now retreating with the knight to a2, and now it's a whole different story because the light squares are very weak. The c4 square can be used for the white pieces, and the a6 pawn is attacked, and this would be great news for white, but not with the world champion. He simply goes c6 and keeps everything completely solid. And now Karjakin decides to trade queens and take on b5, and now decides to improve the position of his knight, still without any perspective here on c3, like we already talked about. No way to go forward, at least. So going backward, knight e2, and maybe aiming to go to c1, d3, or maybe to g3. And now white is also attacking on e5. But you might say, hold on, the e4 pawn is hanging as well, and indeed black could have taken here. He did not, he played bishop b4 instead, but he could have taken. And now white indeed needs to be a little bit careful. Knight takes e5 would be a mistake. That would run into bishop c5 quite unpleasantly, hitting the pawn on f2, and also there's this possibility of the rook intruding on the second rank. So white would be in a little bit of trouble here because knight d3, which first looks good, attacking the bishop on c5 and covering f2, can be answered by rook takes d3, and in the ensuing variations black will be up a pawn right here. Now we look at the material. Black has 5 pawns, white only 4, and black is better. So instead, in this position, which did not occur in the game, just to emphasize that again, white would need to take on e5 with the bishop, because now after bishop c5 white can simply go back bishop d4 and defend quite comfortably against this threat. An interesting variation I would like to just show you real quick. So this would be about equal once again. Knight d2 first looks good to threaten to take on f3 and make take advantage of this loose bishop on e5, but this can be answered with a forced variation. Bishop c7 double attack. Now knight takes f3, rook d2 counterattack against the knight on e2. And at first sight, this looks good for black because the material is even, but white now has this destroyed pawn structure plus the black rook's active, but there's an immediate problem here. This pin, rook a8, pinning the bishop on f8, threatening bishop c5. Black can take on c2, but now the crucial point, white plays b4 and threatens bishop c5 once again, which cannot be prevented, and white will come out on top here because black would need to give up the exchange, and that's just the question whether black can hold a draw or not. So this would be good for white. Let's return all the way back here. Carlsen did not take on e4, would have been equal, but he decided to, I guess, keep more material on the board. Play bishop b4. Well, now I'm kind of contradicting myself because bishop b4 is introducing another exchange here, the exchange of bishops, which happened right here. Knight is back on this square on c3 where the knight is not really happy, but on the other hand, it's also doing a job here defending a pawn on e4. Now knight bd7, similar to a knight on c3, the knight on b6 also is, well, without much perspective here as c4 is covered, so Carlsen is rerouting this knight. Rook a6, activating the rook, makes a lot of sense, attacking the pawn, black defends the rook c8. And now knight c5 is in the air, so white just plays b4, covering the c5 square. And here rook e6 was played, preparing, I think, c5. Indeed, actually, c5 would have been possible right away. Maybe could have asked some more questions, at least that's how I feel. Now, white needs to play a specific sequence of moves to not be worse. For example, taking on c5 wouldn't be a good idea. Black takes back, defends the pawn, and can now put pressure on the c-file, and especially this pawn c2. So, after c5, white would need to take on b5. C takes b4. Now you might say, well, hold on, white is winning the exchange, right? Not quite, since black has this move, rook e6, pinning the knight in d6. And in fact, white needs to take on c8 now, because otherwise he can't get out of this pin comfortably. So takes on c8 and rook takes a6. And this position is still equal, but at least to my mind, it feels like black maybe can do something here. For now, king f8, covering e7 squared, the knight is a little bit, well, misplaced, needs to come back, rook c6, attacking this one. White needs to play some passive moves here. It still all seems to work out for white. It seems to be equal. Here knight takes e4, this knight takes f7 counter tactic. But it just feels like this was a continuation which posed a little bit more problems to white. After rook e6, white played, Karjakin played rook b1, which is a prophylactic move aimed against c5, which happened anyway. Which was a good decision, because if black waits for too long here and plays differently, it feels like white can maybe improve his position more, and with this active rook has better chances. So Carlsen recognized that and decided to simplify the position. He played c5. Now we see the rooks come off the board. This double pawn really doesn't matter that much. And knight takes b5, and we see all the queenside pawns being liquidated. Rook takes c2. Now knight d6 played, and we only have pawns on one side of the board. Material is equal. And here there was a move repetition, king g1, and Karjakin offered a draw, which was accepted by Magnus Carlsen. So the second game, once again a draw, and to my mind quite similar to the first game. Karjakin was not able to pose any problems. It looked like optically that he had this tiny edge of the space advantage, but really he could not do anything with it. And it really wasn't much of an edge anyway, because black position was completely solid. And then maybe when he could have gone into this direction of pressing a little bit with knight a2, he missed his chance, went for a4, went for simplifications, and then the natural outcome was a draw. So that was game 2. Tomorrow we have a rest day. If you want to read further reports, you can either go to Chess24, or you can also check out a new blog I'm part of, which is called beyondchess.com, beyond-chess.com. on which we'll also have further reports on the World Championship. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this analysis, and I see you again soon. Goodbye.